Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Alma College in Michigan. And I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's in Greece, Rome, India, China, the Near East, or beyond. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about Aristotle's belief in the wandering womb and how complicated it is. It's so much more complicated in his text than in people like Plato and the Hippocratic authors. And I will explain why, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think there's actually a scholarly disagreement about this. We'll explore some scholars who think that Aristotle doesn't actually believe in the wandering womb, and I think they're mistaken. And I think that it's very clear and demonstrable that they're mistaken, but I'm going to try to explain why they make this mistake, what I think is leading them astray. But we'll go over some textual evidence for Aristotle's belief in the wandering womb. So I think it's appropriate to begin first by talking about what this idea of the wandering womb is. I did do an episode on it many, many months ago that you can look at or listen to if you want to, which goes into a much greater level of detail about this idea. But I think that I can do a pretty good, brisk recap of this theory, the theory of the wandering womb. So the idea that emerges in ancient Greece at some point in the classical period. So, it's well attested in the 4th century BC, but we also have some texts about it from the 5th century BC. So we can probably say at some point in the 400s BC that again that's the 5th century. This idea really comes into its own, but that it might have existed even earlier too. I can't tell you when exactly this idea begins, but we have this idea that a woman's womb wanders through her body. It moves through her body, and while doing so, it causes all sorts of ailments, but especially above all else, we tend to see this associated with breathing ailments. The word that we see again and again is this ancient Greek verb, penigo, which means to suffocate or to stifle. And that word is recurrent through the ancient medical text. And as we'll see, it actually appears in Aristotle too. It doesn't appear in Plato's Timaeus, that verb, but Plato also believes in the wandering womb. And for Plato, he says it causes all sorts of ailments when the womb wanders pathologically through the body, and it especially causes breathing problems. So Plato mentions problems with breathing, but he doesn't use this crucial verb penigo, which means to stifle, but he clearly gets at the same symptom. There are other symptoms too that arise as a result of this, and I'll talk about that when we go through some examples of this in the ancient medical literature. The idea is sometimes called hysteria, but that is not the ancient Greek name for it. It's true, hysteria does come from the ancient Greek word hustera, meaning womb or uterus. And that's where we get our English word hysterectomy from, to have one's uterus removed. And you go through a hysterectomy. Our word hysteria is ancient Greek and does concern this anatomical language, but hysteria is not actually a word that was used by the ancient Greeks. But instead, the ancient Greeks don't really have a name for it. There's a shared agreement, there's a consensus, a shared belief in this symptom. Women's womb wanders through their body, and you describe this in the same way you describe what happens, for example, if your lips started drooping or something like that, your face started to sag. There's no like well-known word for what that would be like. You would just describe the symptom. Oh, your face is sagging, your lips are drooping, whatever. You would, I mean, maybe there's some complicated, sophisticated medical terminology for that nowadays, but the point is that we would probably just describe the way that structure of your body is moving. Similarly, we would describe, if we were in ancient Greece, we would just talk about, oh, the womb has gone to your head, the womb has gone to your liver, and so on and so forth. And so we have a term that scholars might call like uterine movements, womb movements, but that we don't find in the medical literature any specific term like hysteria. Plato himself in the Timaeus is the one who coins the language of womb wandering through the body. He describes the movements of the womb as wandering. He uses this Greek verb planaomai to mean that the womb wanders through the body, and that's where we get this term from. Plato coins the term, but he's not the first person to describe the symptom. Plato does have his own unique twist on this idea that I will explain when I get there. But let's back up. Now that I've talked about the name, let's talk about where this comes from. So it does seem very likely that this is something that lay people believed in before the medical tradition people got their hands on it. I cannot prove that. So I'm going to read off an example of an ancient magical papyrus, an instance of of ancient magical papyri that attests to belief in the wandering room outside of intellectual and medical circles. So let me read off to you this papyrus. I conjure you, O womb, by the one established over the abyss, before earth, heaven, sea, light, or darkness came to be, that you return again to your own seat, and that you do not turn to one side into the right part of the ribs, or into the left part of the ribs, and that you do not gnaw into the heart like a dog, but remain indeed in your own intended and proper place, not chewing as long as I conjure you by the one who in the beginning made the heaven and earth and all that is therein. So this ancient magical papyrus attests to the idea that even outside intellectual circles, lay people believed in the womb's movement through the body. And we know that because it would have been a lay person who was buying this papyrus from someone who was making it for them. The ordinary person couldn't read or write, but they could buy from someone a magical papyrus that would be like efficacious for them. It would come in handy for them. And similarly, we have examples of amulets, that magical amulets that were supposed to guard against uterine movements, or to prevent or to restore them if they happen, like as in cure them if they happened. Now, it is true, though, that this material evidence, the papyrus that I read off and the amulets, come much later. So this papyrus is from Egypt many centuries after Plato and Aristotle and the ancient medical tradition, the Hippocratic authors whom I'll turn to mostly. But and so I cannot prove to you that people also had these beliefs in the 400s BC, or certainly I can prove to you that they had these beliefs in the 500s BC. I mean, that would take us way before the ancient medical tradition started. And when it comes to philosophers at that time, we just have fragments from them, if anything. And so there is a certain threshold beyond which I can't reach past here, but since lay people in the ancient Mediterranean believe this is at some points in Mediterranean history, or at least it does sound right to me that lay people had this, and then ancient medical people took this tradition on board. And so by the time we get to the Hippocratic authors who are writing throughout the classical period, through the 400s, 300s, even the early 200s BC, they are taking this on board, and this might be where the shared consensus, the shared agreement is coming from among these thinkers, that this is something normal people believe. It's as quote unquote obvious as any other thing the human body does, and it's up to medical practitioners to simply take advantage of this belief and incorporate into their medical thinking. Now, when we start looking at ancient gynecological texts that are coming from this tradition we call the Hippocratic tradition, even though we use one term to describe them, we'll call this the Hippocratic corpus, and we'll lump these texts together. Two important disclaimers. One, they don't all agree with each other. So this is actually a very diverse and wide-ranging corpus of ancient texts, and that, again, written over many centuries. Two, they're not written by Hippocrates. I do assume assume there was a guy, Hippocrates, who was this very well reputed, well regarded physician. I assume he actually existed, but it's a matter of some debate, I suppose, about that. No one really thinks that he wrote all of these texts, even if they do think he actually existed. In fact, it's overwhelmingly likely that he wrote none of them and they were just attributed to him later in antiquity. And all these texts are put together. And so among these texts that are put together, maybe four, five, six of them or so are about gynecology. And these gynecological texts all attest to the existence of uterine movements of a womb moving through the body. So here's one I'm reading from the text, The Nature of Women. If a woman's uterus moves against her liver, she will suddenly lose her speech, grind her teeth, and take on a livid coloring. These things befall her suddenly while she is in a healthy state. End quote. So this is again a good example. The woman's uterus moves against her liver, and the doctor would therefore make a diagnosis based on the symptoms. She loses her speech, she grinds her teeth, takes on a livid coloring. Oh, wait, it's the uterus moving against her liver. Here's another one from the Diseases of Women too. When the uterus seems to turn towards the head and suffocation takes hold there, the patient feels heavy in her head and various signs appear in one part of her body. End quote. And so here we have a great example. Now it's not moving towards her liver, but it's moving towards the head. And we get the suffocation idea. And this is actually the verb I mentioned earlier, stifle or suffocate, penigel. This word actually appears here as a noun, penigmos, meaning suffocation. And it is true, the text says seems to turn towards the head, which might not indicate it actually goes in the head. But then again, the patient feels heavy in her head. So it does seem to me the best way to read this passage is to think that the womb is actually moving towards the head, as in it goes into the head. And here's another one from the same text, the Disease of Women too. If the uterus moves close to a woman's heart and provokes suffocation, and her breath rushes upward under force, she will be restless and convulsed. End quote. So here we have the womb moving towards the heart, not the liver or the head in this case, but the heart. And also we get the suffocation symptom, and the breath and the her breath is affected. Her breath rushes upward under force. And we could find tons of things about this. I can find other passages where it goes in the upper abdomen, and then I can find more passages where it goes against the liver. And really, the first one I read from the liver, that was from The Nature of Women, but I could find a passage from from the Diseases of Women too that also describes movement against the liver. Or movement towards the liver, up against the liver. So this is a wide ranging thing, but even texts that tend to disagree would tend to disagree among each other or among themselves, still we can find examples where they actually corroborate this. So great is the agreement, so great is the consensus among ancient medical doctors that there is a wandering womb, uterine movements. One idea that we don't find in the Hippocratic text, but we find in Plato's Timaeus at the end of the Timaeus, is that the womb's movements are explainable because the womb itself is alive. It's not obvious what's causing the womb in the ancient medical text to move. It does look like, for example, that it is responding to moisture. That women's bodies tend to be more moist, have more fluids than the male body. And so the womb is sort of drawn to or attracted to these fluids. Also, we do find the idea that because the womb isn't present in a male body, it has no natural place, that because men don't have a uterus or a womb, there's really no place in the body that a womb should be. And as a result of that, the idea is that the womb can sort of just move all over the place. So it doesn't really have a set location. And then there are all these other scholarly questions like, how does the womb actually do this? Some people will talk about how there are tubes through the women's body. that the womb moves. But these questions don't really have to detain us here because ultimately I want to move on to Aristotle. But in Plato's Timaeus, we find this idea that the womb is actually alive, and this explains its wandering. So, as I said earlier, this is the first time we actually see the term wandering appear to describe the womb's movements, and then this leads to this idea of the wandering womb. This is the language people will regularly employ to talk about this. And in Plato, the womb is actually alive and it's an animal in its own right. Women's bodies have this animal to explain sexual desire. So for Plato, the cure for this is pregnancy, that women are just desiring to conceive a child, so they have to be impregnated. The desire for restored health is actually identical with the desire for sex and conception, that women don't have a healthy desire, healthy sexual desire. All sexual desire for women is pathological. And there are tons of analogies or disanalogies we can draw here with Plato's views about the male body and sexual desire overall. But the central idea for Plato is that the womb is an animal that moves around the body, and because it can move around and do things on its own, we have to talk about it as alive, as a living thing. And this is a step beyond what the ancient medical thinkers, the Hippocratics, thought. They just think it moves, and perhaps in response to moisture, perhaps in response to other things like odors, but it's not like independently animated. It isn't like a living thing in its own right, but that's how Plato talks about it. And Plato thinks that the womb is actually like an animal, and male bodies have an animal inside them too, that explains some parts of our sexual physiology and sexual anatomy. But the idea here is that Plato wants to present this view as like a step beyond the Hippocratic thinkers. The Hippocratics couldn't really explain why the womb moves independently of other things in the body. Whereas for Plato, the idea is that, like, look, my body is ensouled. My body is a soul. It's a living thing. I'm capable of self-motion. Animals are capable of self-motion. We can move ourselves. It's a distinctive feature of living things, and to that extent, things that have a soul. And the womb can do that too. Look, lay people believe it. Medical thinkers believe this. I'm not making this up. This is what other people believe, and we've been saying this for centuries. And therefore, Plato concludes that the womb itself is actually alive because it moves itself through the body. It doesn't wait for something else to move it. It moves itself. Now, when we get to Aristotle, who was Plato's student, there is like a very mixed opinion among scholars whether Aristotle believes this idea too. For example, in the 80s and 90s, D.M. Baum published multiple articles in which he maintained that Plato and Aristotle actually disagree about the wandering womb, that this is something Plato and earlier people believed, but not Aristotle. I don't think Baum would deny that later people believed it too. When you start getting to Galen and Aristeas and so on, and Soranus's gynecology, like, they all have mixed views of this stuff. I mean, some people might say something like, look, the womb isn't alive and we should explain pathologies in terms of the four humors, but still the Hippocratic treatments for uterine movements work. And so, like, that's Galen's view, for example. The idea is that, like, that's a mixed view, right? The treatment options work. The explanations of some of these symptoms might be wrong, but look, like, they're getting at something accurate. But when we look at Aristotle, there are people who, like D.M. Baum, who deny this. Philip van der Rijk in 2005, for example, argued that Plato and Aristotle disagree about the wandering womb thing. This is Plato's view, but not Aristotle's. For example, if Philip van der Rijk says, as Aristotle's opposition to the rival Platonic view that the uterus changes its place in the female body. Now, they're coming from somewhere very, very, very important for us to understand. That the reason why the womb does not actually wander through the body is that the womb is held in place, the uterus is held in place by these broad ligaments. Now, these ligaments were not observed in a human body until the Hellenistic period. So after Aristotle's death in Alexandria in the Hellenistic period. But Aristotle knows about these ligaments through his own interesting biological method, his own way of doing anatomy. For example, in The History of Animals, Book 1, Chapter 16, Aristotle says, the inner parts of human beings are especially unknown, so that we must refer our investigation to those of the other animals that have a nature that is about the same, end quote. And what Aristotle means by that is that because human internal anatomy is obscure to us, the Greeks, for example, generally avoided human dissection, especially in the classical period. There was a moment in Alexandria where the Greeks did this. I have other episodes where I talk about this sort of thing, but let's just flag that for now. The Greeks don't do dissection in this period on human beings. Definitely not Plato. Definitely not the Hippocratics. Definitely not Aristotle. But Plato has his own way of doing biology, and the Hippocratics have their own way of doing biology. They have several actually because the corpus is so diverse. But Aristotle likes to do dissections on animals and then infer from observations of animal bodies structures that are analogous in the human body. And sometimes this leads him very much astray. So Aristotle will think that the human womb has different pockets in it because that's what he observes when he cuts open some animals. I believe pigs, for instance. I could be mistaken about that, but I believe pigs have pockets in their wombs so that when you have multiple births like twins in human beings, I'm sure pigs give birth to more than just two or three in their litter, but the idea is that each fetus gets its own pocket. But that's not the case in human beings. But Aristotle makes an educated inference from his observations of animal bodies. Now, Aristotle does the same thing when he cuts open animal bodies, looks at their looks at the womb, and then sees broad ligaments tying the womb in place, and then he infers from that well, human bodies must have the same ligaments, and so Aristotle's right. They do have the same. We do have the same ligaments. A human woman has the same ligaments tying down her uterus, and so the idea is that Aristotle learns that there is something tying down the womb. And in fact, he talks about this in Generation of Animals, Book 1, Chapter 13. In fact, he actually says that these ligaments stop the womb from planaomai. They stop the womb from wandering. He uses Plato's language from the Timaeus. This is what stops the womb from wandering. And he thinks that there are the same sorts of ligaments that tie down the spermatic ducts in males. And that's again, Generation of Animals, Book 1, Chapter 13. So it looks like Aristotle has successfully ruled out the uterine movement idea, the wandering womb. He even uses that term, wandering, to describe what the womb does not do on account of these broad ligaments that actually exist. So congratulations, Aristotle, you got it. And he did it before these ligaments were ever even observed in anatomical, scientific context. Decades before people like Herophilus and Erasistratus were doing these observations in human bodies, in human corpses, sometimes even living bodies. But that's a big episode in the history of science that deserves its own episode about the way that in Alexandria that we're not just dissecting dead humans, but actually vivisecting humans, cutting open living humans. So, and Aristotle didn't even have to do this. He just inferred it from his method of inferring things from animal bodies, and we call this comparative anatomy, and it's a win for Aristotle. The story is a lot more complicated than that, though. The reason why it's more complicated is that even though Aristotle does believe in ligaments that tether the womb in place, and he does say that these ligaments prevent the womb from wandering, he doesn't outright deny that the womb moves. In fact, for example, in A Generation of Animals, Book 1, Chapter 11, Aristotle talks about the way that a pregnant woman can move her womb upward by yawning. And even when a woman isn't pregnant, the womb can move upward, causing it to suffocate her or stifle her. And in fact, he says that pregnant women who yawn, and as a result, if they yawn specifically close to the time of delivery, they'll actually end up having a difficult delivery, because the uterus or womb tends to move upward when women yawn. And that even when empty, even when the uterus is empty, this can happen. And Aristotle talks about the same symptom that we see in the Hippocratic tradition, that of suffocation, pneumos, and that Plato talks about too, though he doesn't use the word stifling. He doesn't use the word stifling. He instead just talks about breathing difficulties. And Aristotle also gives the example of prolapsed wombs in in History of Animals, Book 7, Chapter 2. There, he argues that excessive sexual desire leads to a prolapsed womb that will be cured by pregnancy. Now, if you're curious about what I mean by prolapsed womb, this is actually something that women's bodies really will do. Unlike the whole yawning can cause respiratory issues by making the womb go upwards, prolapsed wombs really do happen. This is when the pelvic floor muscles and the ligaments, whose existence Aristotle really has correctly inferred from animal dissection, stretch, with the result that the womb falls downward through the vagina. Now, Aristotle's cure is totally senseless. He thinks that pregnancy cures this. So that's a something we saw in Plato, and it's something we also see in the Hippocratic tradition, that you can actually cure uterine movements by means of pregnancy. But Aristotle's cure is senseless for prolapsed wombs. The womb has fallen down. Nothing good could be accomplished by further weighing it down with a fetus. Actually, as a matter of fact, the Hippocratic authors, when they confront prolapsed wombs, they never recommend sex. For example, in On Barrenness, which is another Hippocratic gynecological text, you'll see that like the Hippocratic author recommends like suspending a woman upside down on a ladder. And the idea is like, look, we're going to use what we would today call gravity. The Greeks don't know about gravity, but we would today call this gravity. Since the womb was fallen down through the vagina, we're going to suspend the woman upside down and just use gravity to make the womb re-enter her body that way. And when you look at on for example, the nature of women, that's the discussion in that text of how to treat prolapsed womb. The author does not recommend sex. On barrenness, the author just says the woman is sterile so long as her womb is prolapsed. And so Aristotle's treatment option is or preferred treatment is just totally out of step with what's normal. But notice that he does follow the tradition of Plato. Plato says, look, we cure the uterine movements by means of sex and in pregnancy specifically. There is actually the text, the nature of women does actually, for example, say that women who don't sleep with their husband will actually have prolapsed wombs. But the cure isn't pregnancy or sex there. That's just a point about the etiology of it, about the cause of this. So what's going on there? Aristotle believes in ligaments and says that these ligaments tie the womb down and prevent it from wandering. And yet Aristotle clearly does believe that the womb does move. So what's going on here? Well, firstly, there is no evidence that Aristotle believes in total unrestricted uterine movements. The things that we saw earlier when we were looking at the medical texts, the reason why I highlighted those there is to show you what Aristotle probably doesn't believe, that the womb can, for example, go into a woman's head and make her head feel heavy. That's something we saw earlier from Diseases of Women too, but it probably doesn't exist in Aristotle's thought because of the idea that the womb is actually tethered down. So that restricts some uterine movements. But Aristotle does believe it can still move upward, but it's probably restricted movement upward. It is weird, though, that Aristotle believes in restricted, limited movement and still talks about respiratory problems. I do wonder how far up in the body he thinks the womb can move. I can't believe that he thinks it would move all the way like up to the neck or throat area. But like if it only can only move halfway up the abdomen, it's a little hard to believe that could cause respiratory problems unless he thinks it means that it moves upwards and then it takes all the stuff that was already there and it just displaces that stuff further up, and that's what's causing the respiratory problems. That's possible, but it's really hard to make out what exactly he thinks is happening. How does he explain the respiratory problems? I really wish I knew. The next thing is that Aristotle clearly doesn't want to forgo the whole medical tradition that precedes him. And again, this makes more sense if we believe that lay people believed in the uterine movements too, even though I can't prove exactly that it predates that magical papyrus I read earlier and some of the other material evidence like the amulets. I can't prove that, but that would be it would strengthen the case. It would make it clearer what Aristotle doesn't want to abandon all of this. After all, even though he believes that that the ligaments prevent the womb from wandering, still he's ready to take on board all the stuff about penigmos and penigo, right? The suffocation and the suffocating, the stifling. He's willing to take that on board. So he's clearly indebted to this medical tradition. The other point is that Aristotle really wants to focus on prolapsed wombs, never exclusively, because he does believe in upward uterine movement too, even if it's limited. But prolapsed wombs take on a sort of pride of place in Aristotle's analysis, and prolapsed wombs actually happen. They're actually real. And so, to the extent that this is like an observed phenomenon that perhaps is rare but not super rare and like not unheard of or unprecedented. um Aristotle doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He believes these ligaments exist because of what he observed in animal dissections. He believes these ligaments rule upward movement, but he still wants to take on board and incorporate restricted upward movement, and the pinning mossing, the suffocation. But he clearly also wants to take on board the idea of prolapsed wombs. This is something you could observe, so he wants to believe in them too. And he presents an option, a treatment option that doesn't really make any sense, like taking a woman whose womb has literally, her uterus has literally fallen through the vagina and trying to get this woman pregnant. No, it doesn't make any sense. And other ancient thinkers, like the author of On Barrenness, recognized that this is fully impossible, and others thought it was ill advised, even if they thought it was possible, to try to have sex with such a woman. But Aristotle wants to do that anyway and recommend that anyway. And so, for this reason, I think that the scholars I read off earlier, like Philip van der Eyck, are actually mistaken. Uh, is their view understandable? Absolutely, it is. They're responding to Aristotle's clear statement in the generation of animals that these broad ligaments exist that stop the womb from wandering, from planaomai. And that's right. But like the crucial thing is realizing that Aristotle, though he separates himself from Plato's language of wandering, clearly is not divorcing himself entirely from this tradition. And that's a really important thing to understand about Aristotle's gynecology and his approach to female sexual anatomy, physiology, pathology, and so on. Um, and so by looking at this, we learn a lot about Aristotle as a thinker and as a biologist. There are tons more topics we got to talk about in that this episode broached. I do cover some of these in other episodes too. For example, I have an episode about human vivisection in the Hellenistic period. I have an episode on the wandering room and uterine movements more generally. You can check out both of those episodes if you want to know more. For more on Plato's biology and other topics we've talked about, I'm sure we'll broach those in future episodes too. Thank you very much. You can subscribe to the Ancient Philosophy podcast wherever you find podcasts, such as Apple Podcast and Spotify. We also have a YouTube channel available for video episodes. I have a book available for purchase on Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which is available wherever you buy books, such as Amazon or directly through the publisher Hackett. I also have a Substack, platosfishtrap.substack.com. Check that out if you're interested. Thank you very much.